Hi sewing friends, welcome to my sewing room. My name is Beth, and if you're new, welcome. Today I'm sharing with you a quilt that I purchased on Facebook Marketplace. This quilt, as you see it right now, was $20, and I thought it was definitely worth $20 even though there was work to be done. The lady I bought it from purchased the quilt top that was hand-pieced on eBay, I believe, a long time ago, and then she paid to have a long arm quilter baste the quilt so that she could quilt it. She did begin quilting, hand quilting one of the flowers in the flower garden here, and then it was not finished. So rather than hand quilt this quilt, since it's a pretty heavy batting, I think it's probably warm and natural, and I learned long ago that warm and natural is probably not the batting that you want to use for hand quilting. You might want to use wool or a thin polyester, but this was not the kind of batting that I would be able to hand quilt. So I did wonder how I was going to quilt it, and in the end I decided to use the basting lines that the long arm quilter added as my guide. I just thought might as well just use what's there. I thought about doing something fancy, but in the end I'm going to do a very simple grid using the basting lines. The basting lines were put in pretty uniform and so I took my sewing machine and I gave myself a little bit larger stitch length, and I went through the whole quilt and I quilted on both sides of all of the basting lines. This quilt is really beautiful, and it's just full of some really fun old fabrics. So as I quilted, I was able to admire all these beautiful fabrics that the quilter added long ago. Here's a close-up of those basting lines and my quilting lines on both sides of that big stitch you can see. And so when I had put in both of my quilting lines, I took a little pair of scissors and I snipped those basting stitches and every few inches, and I just pulled up that loose line of thread. When I had surrounded all of the basting lines with my quilting stitches, I decided to add some more quilting stitches going through those long rectangles so that my stitches would be a little closer together. So I used my ruler and some painter's tape and I marked lines through the quilt, and I'll just follow that painter's tape as I go along. When I use this method of quilting, I do one line at a time and I use short pieces of tape. These are about 12 inches long, and I reuse them every time I make a new line. I love the way this simple quilting turned out. I used a gold thread. I didn't want to use a red thread to match the background. I didn't want it to disturb those flowers. I think the gold or the golden yellow I used kind of blended in with the flowers, and then you can see it in the background. So that's always a choice to make as you choose thread for quilting. It's always kind of a decision what part of the quilt you want to see that thread. Now that it's been quilted and most of those basting stitches are removed, I'm going to trim the quilt so that I can add my binding. So I will trim away the excess batting and backing using the quilt top as my guide, and I'll be adding a binding all the way around. It's a sort of that dark maroon color. The quilt came with some leftover strips of fabric, so I'll be using that fabric for my binding. Here is that leftover fabric that came with the quilt, which was really nice. So I'm going to cut strips that are 2.5 inches wide, and I'll be joining all of my strips to go all the way around my quilt. I pressed the long binding strip in half, and I will be attaching it to the front of my quilt. I laid my binding strip on one of the sides of the quilt, and I'll begin sewing about 10 inches or so from the end of the binding. When I got to the corner, I stopped and left my needle down, and then I sewed off the end. I sort of made a little tiny diagonal seam there, and I folded the binding up and down so the fold is right there at the top, and I'm going to begin sewing right through that fold, and I'll go around my quilt and stop at all the corners and do the same thing so that when the binding is rolled to the front, it will have a nice corner. When I got to the end, I stopped about 12 inches away from where I started, and I'm going to fold one side over, and I'll cut the right side there right next to the fold. I need at least 2.5 inches in that strip on the left, and I open my little piece I cut off. It's 2.5 inches, and I'm going to measure from the fold over so that strip on the left is exactly 2.5 inches longer. Now I will put right sides together, just like I joined my binding when I made that long strip. I'll put right sides together sort of at that right angle there, and I will sew a seam from corner to corner, and I always double check to make sure that it fits on the quilt top. So I'm checking to see if it fits, and it does, so I will pin down after I cut away that little triangle on the back, that excess fabric. I will pin it on my quilt and I'll finish sewing the binding down. Now all I need to do is roll the binding to the back, and I will be pinning all the way around, and I'll have my evening work all ready to go. This is something I really enjoy doing at night, work like this, just simple sewing that I don't have to use a lot of brain power for. So I'll be sewing that binding down with a needle and thread later this evening. Here is that beautiful quilt, all complete. This is such a lovely quilt, and I am so happy that I was able to get it completed. Just a really fun collection of some beautiful fabrics, and what a beautiful pattern. Thanks for joining me today, and I'll see you next time.